Mr Speaker, today I am introducing the Land Transport Clean Vehicle Discount Repeal Amendment Bill into the House, which gives effect to the National Party's commitment to ending the UTE tax within our first 100 days. This piece of legislation is also part of our coalition agreement with the ACT Party, who made the same commitment ending this scheme, and which is reflected in our coalition agreement between our two parties. This is good news for our farmers and tradies who have been hammered by the last government and who were forced to pay exorbitant fees buying the vehicles they needed to be able to do their jobs. This bill ends the unnecessary, regressive and fiscally irresponsible UTE tax and discount scheme, and is an important priority for the government, and it is one of our first actions in our 100 days. Axing the UTE tax is one of the policies New Zealanders voted for, and which they expect us to deliver, and which we are delivering for. Mr Speaker, this bill does a number of things. Firstly, what it does is repeals the legislation to ensure that the scheme ends on the 31st of December 2023, both for the discounts and also for the tax. It repeals the legislation which the last government put in place and requires that that scheme comes to an end. This scheme needs to come to an end for three very important reasons. Firstly, it is fiscally irresponsible. The scheme has cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars, and it will only continue to cost taxpayers more and more money the longer that it stays in place. Through to the 30th of November 2023, $579 million was paid out in rebates, $13.5 million spent in costs to establish and operate the scheme, while $290 million has been received from charges. This has meant, Mr Speaker, the scheme the taxpayers have had to foot the bill by an eye-watering $302.5 million deficit paid to NZTA via grants from the Crown. That is taxpayers' money. Now, on this side of the House, we respect taxpayers' money, and we know that money doesn't just grow on trees. Now, I think that's the philosophy of the former government, and that is one of the reasons why they are now in opposition, is because they had a view that money simply grew on trees. And so, Mr Speaker, this scheme was fiscally irresponsible. And to address that, what the Crown would have had to have done to continue with this scheme was to do a number of potential changes. Firstly, possibly lowering or restricting rebates to EVs, effectively not continuing with the high subsidies that were put in place by the former government. Increasing charges even more for UTE buyers, making it even harder for our farmers and tradies who needed to purchase the vehicles they need to be able to do their job, or providing even more Crown funding. And as the former government thinks money grew on trees, that probably is exactly what they would have done, and thrown more taxpayers' money into a scheme which is fiscally irresponsible. And so by ending this scheme by the 31st of December, we don't need to do any of those actions. Instead, we can ensure that this fiscally irresponsible scheme comes to an end. But, Mr Speaker, we also need to look at the inequities that the scheme was providing. And one of the key facts which I highlighted yesterday in question time was around how this scheme was taking money from people who had very little choice around the types of vehicles that they could use. And I hear Grant McCullum, the excellent member for Northland, who is doing a great job in that electorate, and who needs his ute to get around his electorate and his farm. And the reality is it was taking money from people like him, people who don't have the choice around purchasing an electric vehicle for their type of work, and making and then subsidising people who do have the choice. In fact, over $122 million was provided to people and provided as subsidies to people purchasing electric vehicles worth over $70,000 in the last 18 months. Wow. Taking money from people who have little choice, people who are taking... Well, I hear the former minister for a lot of things, emphasis on former, complaining about this bill. I look forward to her speech a little bit later. But the point is, this policy was taking from those who didn't have a choice and giving it to people who could afford to pay for those vehicles. And so by ending this scheme, we're ending the reverse Robin Hood scheme. I thought the party opposite. I thought they were the party for workers. I thought they were the party for workers. They've tried to spend the last 2 days trying to tell everybody in this House how much they care about the workers. But actually, what they are the party of is they want to subsidise people who can already afford to buy a very high-end electric vehicle and provide them more subsidies. That is actually who the party is over on the other side. And so by removing this scheme, we remove the inequities that it was providing. Finally, Mr Speaker, by removing the scheme, we're able to actually focus on what is required to actually improve the uptake of electric vehicles in New Zealand, what will make a real difference, and that is investing in the electric vehicle charging infrastructure that we need across New Zealand. And on this side of the House, we are the party of infrastructure. We are the party which gets things done, and we will be rolling out policies to implement 10,000 electric vehicle chargers by 2030 to actually ensure that people purchasing electric vehicles have the confidence to be able to charge their vehicles and travel around New Zealand, because what we know is that car manufacturers around the world are switching to electric in all of their production chains. We don't need to be providing very expensive subsidies to make them do that. In fact, we are such a small part of the car market in the world. What we do makes a very little difference. In fact, those cars will be coming here. And I note even Ford announced yesterday that on the 1st of January, the day after this scheme ends, they are reducing the price of their vehicles by $5,000. And so the car industry will be keen to make sure the vehicles they are manufacturing around the world will be coming to New Zealand, that New Zealanders will continue to have the choice and the range of electric vehicles, and we'll provide the electric vehicle charging infrastructure so they can have that uptake, so we can electrify our fleet here in New Zealand. We have a positive plan to do that. We don't need an inequitable scheme which is fiscally irresponsible, which is what the past government does. I commend the bill to the House.
I call the Honourable Megan Woods.
Madam Speaker, well, this certainly is an interesting debate, and I'm very much looking forward to the committee stage where we get to ask the Minister some very detailed questions, because there are a lot of questions that we have on this side of the House. But, Madam Speaker, what we do know is that this is yet another piece of legislation that this government is putting up, which is about dragging New Zealand backwards. Now, I've heard speakers in this debate ask why we need this. Well, I think it shows something that members on the government benches are asking why we need it. So let's go back to the very basics. New Zealand has signed up to something called a nationally determined contribution in terms of our climate change targets. This is something that was agreed by the John Key government. In order to reach that NDC, when we came into government, we needed to put together a plan, because there was no plan of how to reach our nationally determined contribution. What that resulted in was multi-partisan agreement on an approach to climate change was that we would have carbon budgets and that we would have emission reduction plans sector by sector that would show what work that sector had to do to reach New Zealand's targets. Now, Madam Speaker, transport has some work to do. Transport is responsible for a large number of emissions, and therefore there are a number of emissions reductions that are needed. Light vehicles are a critical part of the contributions to our vehicle emissions. In order to do that, People either need to stop travelling in cars and mode shift, or they need to switch the kind of cars they are driving, and that is to electric cars. In order to do that and to get the kind of uptake that is required, and let's be very clear, because, Madam Speaker, this is a debate about specifics, and I am yet to hear a member on the government venture into the realm of specifics and tell us what they are going to do to substitute in the emissions reduction plan. There is a legislative requirement to do that, Madam Speaker. So the ERP sets out the target to reduce transport emissions by 41% from 2019 levels by 2035. And the ERP also sets a further target to increase zero-emission vehicles to 30% of the light fleet by 2035. Now, if there is not to be a clean car discount, how are we going to achieve that? We have heard from government members that ETS will do that. So I am looking forward to contributions that tell us at what price does the ETS have to be to drive the behavioural change that will cause the switch. Because every piece of research that has been produced has said that it currently is not enough. So I want to know from members opposite, what will the ETS price be that will be required to drive that behavioural change? Hasn't happened in any other jurisdiction. We have our Independent Climate Commission in the report released just this week tell us that there needs to be supplementary measures to the ETS in order to drive the behavioural change, and they're very clear on that, Madam Speaker. So that is something that I am looking forward to us getting into the nitty-gritty and the detail, and I'm sure the Minister will come armed with the details, because of course this is a Minister that thinks he doesn't have to release the regulatory impact statement before the legislation is passed. He's told New Zealanders they can OIA it and read it after the legislation is passed. So I'm sure he's got the details, Madam Speaker, because a Minister that is that confident must be all over every detail of the policy, and we'll see that when it comes to committee stage. And then, Madam Speaker, the other argument we've had is no, we'll let the ETS do it, so I'm looking forward to knowing the modelled pricing of the ETS that will be required for that. And he's telling us we'll build it and they will come, that there will be a charging infrastructure, and this is part of the National Party commitments. There's only one thing. This is a thruple, Madam Speaker. And in the coalition agreement with the ACT Party, and I read, they poured some cold water on it, Madam Speaker. They haven't said they can just get on with the rollout of the 10,000 public EV chargers by 2030 that the National Party promised in their manifesto commitment. They're saying, show us the business case. Show us the business case. So I look forward to the Minister telling us when he's in the chair what the timeline is, how many there'll be. Are they AC charges? Are they DC charges? Where will they be? All this kind of detail. Because if this is the kind of policy we are relying on to get the kinds of upticks that I have talked about in my speech, we're going to need to see some detail. Then we have heard the crocodile tears of the government benches over the equity considerations of this policy. The problem is those members need to go and look at some detail. And again, I point those members to the very fine document released by the Independent Climate Commission this week on advice on their second emissions budget that reports on the equity provisions of this policy, because that was something that we thought about as a government when we implemented it, and the very reason that we made the clean car discount apply to New Zealand new second-hand vehicles. Because, Madam Speaker, I know, and I do represent an electorate, and I represent an electorate of people who would never dream, usually, of buying a brand new car. They buy their cars second-hand. And it is the very reason that we included New Zealand new second-hand electric vehicles within this. So, Madam Speaker, let's put some facts into this debate. And I'm going to read you what the Climate Commission says around the equity provisions of this. And it says the second emissions budget presents opportunities for the government to ensure more equitable access to EVs. Second-hand vehicles have been a major portion of imported vehicles, accounting for approximately 40% of light vehicles registered. For many, these vehicles are more affordable than new vehicles and have provided a critical means of transport. During the second emission budget, supply of second-hand EVs may be constrained, and goes on to say that more work needs to be done. And Madam Speaker, I take you also to the work that was done on the previous policy when we looked about what we were going to do to amend the policy. And it said, while there is evidence that wealthier New Zealanders are more likely to adopt EVs and by implication benefit from the clean car discount, purchase data suggests that average New Zealanders are likely to have benefited most. To date, markedly more buyers of used imports received rebates, 56.2%, than buyers of new vehicles at 38.5%. At the same time, fewer buyers of used imports paid charges, 14.7%, and buyers of new vehicles 39.7%. So unfortunately for the members on the government benches, their claims to finally be standing up for the working New Zealanders, despite cutting employment as a Reserve Bank consideration and removing fair pay agreements yesterday, fall on deaf ears when you look at the evidence. When you see how the discount has been applied, who's been benefiting it and who has been paying it. So, Madam Speaker, I think it is time, given that we've got a government that is so confident in itself, it's passing this under urgency, no select committee process, and a minister who has the RIS locked in the safe in his office, rather than releasing it to the people of New Zealand, that we get down to some details on this, because, Madam Speaker, details matter. And I look forward to the government being able to answer the plethora of questions that we will put to them in the committee stage, because listening to this debate has only led me to write down more and more questions, Madam Speaker, because we have a government that is taking New Zealand backwards. It is done for no other reason than you guys did it, therefore we want to reverse it. Look around the world to those on the government benches and you will see Conservative governments around the world have implemented similar schemes. This is not something that should be about the political divide. This should be about how we as a nation meet our commitments and our targets to reduce our climate emissions. I want to see what the government is going to meet there. They are scrapping, and make no mistake about it, Madam Speaker, they are scrapping one of the most successful schemes that we have had to reduce our domestic emissions, and they are signing New Zealand up to pay other countries to decarbonise rather than backing New Zealanders, Madam Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Julianne Genter.
Mr. Speaker, I reiterate that we are all in this together. We have to tackle the climate crisis together, and that requires us to look at the system, and it's very easy in politics to frame everything in an individual way and talk about individuals, but we have to look at the system and how we can tweak the system to get better outcomes for all New Zealanders in a way that is fair. And that's why I would ask members in the government benches to listen carefully to my speech, because I'm going to lay out the rationale for the clean car discount and the evidence that it actually was reducing emissions in a fair way, that it is popular and supported by New Zealanders, despite the misinformation, attack ads perpetuated by the National Party and the ACT Party over 2 years, mischaracterizing the policy, so that New Zealanders didn't get the full opportunity to understand just how beneficial this policy was to our country. But no matter what, despite the repeal today, we saved 2 megatons of carbon. We saved 70 million litres of petrol a year, $100 million a year that New Zealand is spending less on imported oil. and it would have been more if they'd carried on the policy. So this is a policy that not only reduces emissions, it saves New Zealand money as a country, it reduces our reliance on imported fossil fuel, and it did something that was considered impossible before it was brought in. Our average carbon emissions per kilometre of the new vehicles coming into our fleet, this is not the existing fleet. We have a massive existing fleet of over 4 million vehicles that was not affected by this policy, over 500,000 utes probably that were not affected by the policy. But the new vehicles coming into New Zealand emitted 186 grams per kilometre on average before this policy, and within 2 years the average was down to 121 grams per kilometre. That's on par with European countries that had been far more advanced than we were at having fuel economy standards, at having price incentives like the clean car discount, and that was a 35% reduction. So not only did we reduce carbon emissions and pollution, but we reduced the amount of money we were paying to power our vehicles collectively as a country, and that's a direct productivity and economic benefit to New Zealand Inc. Now, so that's why it's a really good policy, and the numbers don't lie, and I know that this graph isn't as big as I would like, but what you can see is the impact of the policy is that we're importing fewer fossil fuel vehicles than we were importing low emissions vehicles, not just electric, but low emission. So one of the problems that New Zealand was facing, and this is a problem for business and for households in New Zealand, was that we had no fuel economy standards. We're one of only 3 countries in the OECD to not have fuel economy standards, along with Australia and Russia. And we had no price incentive at the point of purchase. So the vehicle industry was not prioritizing low emissions vehicles to our market. So New Zealanders didn't even have the choice. There was, for example, more fuel-efficient utes on the market in the UK that were not available in New Zealand before this policy. So this isn't just about influencing the choice that New Zealanders make when they go to purchase a vehicle. And by the way, over 50% of all brand new vehicles purchased in New Zealand are purchased by businesses, not by households. The vast majority of households, and I would tell you, there is not a single low-income household in New Zealand buying a brand new vehicle in New Zealand. So the entire market for new to New Zealand vehicles is wealthier than average as individual households or as businesses. So what the price incentive did is it let the vehicle manufacturers and vendors prioritize low emissions vehicles to our market. And I have an anecdote about this. So my friends in 2021 wanted to buy an EV. They were talking to Hyundai. They said, we want the new Ioniq. And they were told they were going to have to wait at least 6 months to get one. And the day after the clean car discount was announced, they said, we can have it within 4 weeks. So this policy, the clean car discount, changed the market of vehicles that were available to New Zealanders. And the highest emitting vehicles are the most profitable for the vehicle manufacturers. That's why they like to prioritize high emitting vehicles, and that's why they spend most of their money advertising SUVs and utes as lifestyle vehicles, not work vehicles. They advertise them as lifestyle vehicles, and they try to sell as many as possible because they make more profit off that. But that's why you need fuel economy standards and you need the price incentive at the point of purchase. So this number doesn't lie, okay? This number doesn't lie. And if the new government, the new National Act government, actually has any way of achieving the carbon budgets that they've signed up to, they are now going to have to rely on increasing the price of fuel. Now, that affects not just the vehicles coming into New Zealand. It really doesn't affect the vehicles coming into New Zealand, but it affects every single person using a fossil fuel-powered vehicle in the country. So now you're saying, oh, we need to reduce emissions. We have to put up the carbon price in the ETS. People have no choice but to pay more or drive less. So that's why trying to do it through the ETS isn't a good idea, because now the farmers are going to have to pay more for fuel because we haven't imported more zero-emissions vehicles to reduce emissions. So I know maths is hard for the National Party. That is obvious. But The math says that you are going to make it easier for farmers and easier for those tradies who need to drive utes to do their job and not be affected by high price of fuel if you have a policy like the clean car discount, which results in more zero and low emissions vehicles being brought into the country. That is the truth. And the policy is fair. And we have polling that shows, despite the misinformation attack ads that have been out there, waging a culture war instead of trying to constructively solve a problem that affects everyone, that will affect our farmers probably more than anyone else. The climate crisis is going to affect our farmers. It has already affected our farmers. It has already affected our rural areas. Billions of dollars in damage because of storms that are directly caused by human-caused climate change. And those are going to keep flowing in. And the world is looking to us, New Zealand, just like every other country, to pull our weight and do our bit. And we are capable of doing that. When I presented this policy to the Imported Vehicle Association, the VIA, I talked to them about how my grandfather went to World War II, and I'm sure many of your family members did as well, and they made a huge sacrifice to do the right thing. And when it comes to the climate crisis, something that is affecting the whole world, we will all have to make changes. And the question is, are we willing to do our bit? And from the ACT Party, the New Zealand First, the answer is no, we're not going to do our bit. We're going to wage a culture war rather than constructively looking at practical solutions that will actually achieve the outcomes we want, that will improve productivity, that will reduce costs. And the reality is they're either not going to make any attempt whatsoever to meet our carbon budgets, and therefore we're not going to play our part on the world stage, and we're going to be penalized in our free trade agreements where we've committed to those targets, or they're going to have to put up the carbon price so much that everyday New Zealanders, when they go out to try and drive around, because they don't have more fuel-efficient vehicles, because we've imported hundreds of thousands fewer electric vehicles as a result of repealing this bill, they're going to have to pay more to drive around the country because you're relying only on the ETS. And Simon Court very accurately says he can't understand, and I can see members opposite are having a difficult time following me because it is a little bit complex. But that's why it's so important for New Zealanders. It's our responsibility. It's the responsibility of government to do the work, to look at the practical solutions, to look at the system and say, what is going to reduce the average emissions coming from new vehicles imported to New Zealand? And the answer is a combination of fuel economy standards and a price incentive at the point of purchase, exactly what this clean car discount was. The clean car discount was a huge success, and this government will never take that away from the Greens or from New Zealand, that we saved 2 megatons of carbon through this policy, that we kicked off a massive increase in the market for zero emissions vehicles, for electric vehicles. But the truth is that they are going to slow down progress now. They're going to slow down progress, and that means it's going to be more expensive later, that it's going to be harder for New Zealanders to access second-hand electric vehicles, because without the price incentive, we're going to import fewer electric vehicles, which means there's less vehicles in the second-hand fleet for New Zealanders to access. And it will be worse for farmers because they're going to have to spend more money on their utes when the carbon price goes up, and they're going to be hit again and again by storms. And our free trade agreements, I wish we had fair trade agreements, our FTA with the EU, we're going to be penalized. Our farmers are going to be penalized because we're going to be seen to be pariahs on the world stage, not doing our bit when we could have done something that was good for the economy, that was good for the climate, and that was fair. The reality of this National Act, New Zealand First dinosaur government taking us back into the dark ages with their culture wars.
Simon Court.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to invite that member to nominate what kind of dinosaur she thinks I am. Some days I come to work, I fancy myself as a pterodactyl, soaring high above the forests of ancient New Zealand. But today I feel like a T-Rex, smashing and stomping stupid policy.
Ms. Genter, just hold on, stop the clock. Return to your seat, stand, withdraw and apologise.
I withdraw and apologise, Mr. Speaker.
No, sit down.
I'm leaving.
Then stand up. Now, withdraw and...
I withdraw and apologise, Mr. Speaker.
Now, please do not yell as you're leaving the chamber.
Mr. Speaker.
Continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, and that's what happens when you mess with the T-Rex or the Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, and to those New Zealanders listening to Parliament or watching on Parliament TV today, we are proud in the ACT Party, as part of the coalition government, that the National ACT Coalition Agreement commitment to repeal the UTE tax will happen before Christmas. It is on the 100 days plan. We're going to get it done. We're just a few weeks into Parliament and we're already making a significant difference in New Zealanders' lives. Now, what we've heard from the opposition, that previous group of political parties that passed the UTE tax bill, is that this bill will lead to some kind of climate catastrophe, that our emissions will go through the roof, and that only with this policy would New Zealand's transport emissions be reduced. Well, it ignores one basic fact. The previous speaker, Julianne Genter, could not explain why this policy was necessary. She gave an overly complicated description of why it was necessary and how it would work. There's a much simpler solution. That is the emissions trading scheme. Every single vehicle that fills up with petrol or diesel in New Zealand pays for their emissions under the emissions trading scheme, somewhere between $9 or $10, maybe $12 for a 50-litre tank of petrol or diesel. And that is an incentive to reduce less fuel and move to a more efficient vehicle. Now, that is the most simple solution available to New Zealand consumers and businesses. This policy, the Clean Vehicle Discount or UTE tax, was completely unnecessary. It ignored the trade-offs that were obvious to the ACT Party when we were in opposition, proposing that this bill wasn't necessary. The trade-offs, a $300 million deficit now between the revenue collected under the scheme and what was paid out to people to subsidise them to buy electric vehicles. That $300 million deficit is a terrible trade-off. We have all kinds of infrastructure in New Zealand desperate for investment, and yet the previous government chose instead to invest taxpayer money into supplying electric vehicles to New Zealand's wealthiest people, as the former Speaker Julianne Genter pointed out. We're pleased that this bill will repeal the UTE tax, and we look forward to stopping the transfer of wealth from consumers and taxpayers to others who don't need it, and restoring sensible, practical public policy. Mr. Speaker.